Thanks everyone for joining. We're getting ready to talk about one of my very favorite topics, and that is load assignments in practice. I think this is something that's really important. It's a detail to be sure, but it's a really non-trivial detail that can have a huge impact on the effectiveness of your programming, and it's really helpful in communicating what you want as far as training adaptations and stresses when you're applying your training programs. So this is actually, I wrote an article on this. You may have missed this. I wanted to kind of call some attention to it because I like this topic so much. I called it Communicating Load Prescriptions, a Common Error of Omission. It's over on the Bridge blog site. So definitely check that out afterwards if you haven't checked it out already. That would be a good kind of read for you. But I want to kind of preface this by just kind of reading this, which I don't normally do, but I'm going to read right off of this because it kind of will set the stage for what I'm going to talk about. So I stated at the very beginning of this article, I believe that one of the biggest unintentional errors of omissions of many training programs that I've read, seen, reviewed, and personally written in the past, so I'm talking to myself when I say this, is a lack of communication when it comes to what loads should be selected for a given set or rep protocol in a training program. I think that we as programmers, and I'm saying we because I mean me too, we often assume what we want and people understand what we want just when we write, a set and rep prescription on the paper. I think it's really important to clearly communicate that load prescription to our clients when we assign a program. It's basically how hard we want it to be and what we're looking for in that. And we also need to communicate a progression plan as well, but that's really, I was telling Lauren earlier, that's probably a good topic for another webinar down the road, is communicating a clear progression plan to our clients and athletes as well. But what we're going to talk about is really the kind of first part of that, which is the kind of first part of a training cycle, especially like a linear progression cycling program. We're going to figure out what weight we need to start with at the very beginning. That's part of the progression, but that's what we're going to really focus on. And most importantly, the many options and methods you have available to utilize within the BridgeAthletic platform to do these things. So with that said, let's get started here. So again, thank you for joining. Please go over onto my Instagram profile and then go to the free coaching habits checklist. It's a useful tool to kind of evaluate yourself. There's a little rubric you can rate yourself and look at all the things that we found to be really important from a coaching standpoint. All right, let's talk about programming variables. So when we talk about periodization, we know that the simplified version of that definition is simply a planned manipulation of training variables. What are those training variables that we manipulate over time, periods of time, hence the name periodization. So number one, these are kind of written, they are written in what order we think they are most important. Number one, repetitions is probably the variable that's manipulated most often in most training programs. And then sets, number of sets, which is part of the volume equation, repetitions and sets, and then loading or intensity, and which is also part of volume. That's what we're going to spend the bulk of the time talking about today. This is kind of a big umbrella when we talk about loading or intensity, because it also encompasses our just pure intensity in terms of intensity of load or intensity of effort. It also can incorporate and include that progression plan that I mentioned earlier. So that's kind of a gigantic one with a lot of little sub categories underneath it. Our tempo, speed of movement on our different exercises, our rest periods between sets of exercises, and then what we consider to be the most individualized portion of programming is exercise selection. These are all important. They're just kind of listed in order of what we feel is most important down to least important in terms of these 6 things. But make no mistake, these are all incredibly important, and they're all programming skills that you need to master. But again, today we are going to focus on number 3, which is intensity. And they're all very, very interrelated, especially these top 3. It's really hard really to define which is most important, because one without the other doesn't really mean a whole lot. So and you always have to reference the other things when you talk about one of those things. So we're going to talk about the thing which is intensity. So let's define what intensity is first and foremost. And I mentioned that real briefly when we were going through that list. So we feel that there's 2 types of intensity definitions. First one is intensity of load. So what does that mean? That's really quite simply the weight one is using when it comes to performing an exercise. It doesn't have to be an external load. It can be, a load, like if you're doing a push-up and you put it on an incline, there's a certain percentage of weight that's on your upper body. So you're just kind of minimizing the effects of gravity, but it is, in simple terms, just the weight that you are using. So typically defined and expressed as a percentage of a 1 repetition maximum load, which is abbreviated to %1RM. Or that's simply the most weight one could lift for 1 repetition on a given exercise. Obviously, that's done with proper technique or to a certain standard. The other thing about intensity of load, it can also be expressed as just a specific RM load. So, or an estimated RM load. So for example, if I'm doing 3 sets of 6 and I assign a client, I want you to use your 8 repetition maximum load for the given exercise. So they know what weight they can normally do for 8. They can use that for their 3 sets of 6. And this is also standardized too for research study reasons too, because we have to be able to speak from a common place. So %1RM is traditionally used with a lot of research studies and, within exercise physiology to have that standardization, so there's less variability. The second part of the definition when it comes to intensity is intensity of effort. And this is a little more nebulous and squishy. So I kind of grown fond of the term intensiveness to differentiate between the 2 types of intensity, because that kind of really implies the connotation of effort. I've grown fond of that term to kind of differentiate that a little bit. So this is typically defined as how hard or difficult a given set is relative to the number of reps being performed or what were prescribed. So this is commonly expressed in terms of RPE, rating of perceived exertion. The key point here is it's based upon repetitions in reserve. We're going to talk about more of that in an upcoming slide here in a minute, and the difference between RPE and RIR, why they get confused, and why RIR is probably a more straightforward way to communicate that to our athletes and clients. And we'll speak about that here in a moment. So I also want to note that intensity of effort can also be expressed as a percentage of repetition max load. So this is really, and we're going to talk about this on a later slide as well, this is the percent difficulty parameter that you may have seen in BridgeAthletic. And it's also often called relative intensity. So we're going to break all these things down here going forward and explain them and show you what it looks like actually within the platform when you are prescribing these different things. I also kind of fond of these terms when it comes to descriptors of these 2 different types of intensity. So intensity of load would be, the way I would describe those would be heavy, medium, or light. I think sometimes people would describe load in terms of the pure weight on the bar as hard, moderate, or easy. And I wouldn't necessarily do that. I try to differentiate between those things. So for example, typically with 85% of 1 RM, an average person or typical person commonly can perform like 5 or 6 reps with that load at a repetition max of that 85%. But if they just did 1 rep with that, that is still a heavy load, because it's close to 100% of 1 repetition max. 85% is pretty close to that. If you just did 1 rep, that's still heavy, but it's not necessarily hard because you're still able to do 4 or 5 more reps with it. So effort communicated in terms of repetitions performed, I like to use the descriptors of hard, moderate, or easy. I think what often happens is clients in particular, a lot of the clients that I've worked with in general population, they will kind of confuse the idea of if something's light, it should also be easy. We know that looking back at a lot of the research when it comes to hypertrophy training, that when you use a lighter load, you can do a lot of repetitions with it, but you need to go very close to failure, proximity to failure, to have similar hypertrophy effects as compared to heavier loads. So yes, a light load is less than a heavy load in terms of percentage of 1 rep max, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily supposed to be easy. So I like to use these terms to communicate those things as well when I ask someone, a client, to describe that, because they're really going to communicate in terms of hard, moderate, or easy. I'm thinking in terms of the percentage of 1 rep max when I'm looking at this top row. Okay. All right. So all that said, that's a little bit of background. Let's show you how to actually do these things. So I'm going to do this mainly through PowerPoint here. At the end of the presentation, if there's some questions or some ideas pop up in my brain about how wanting to show you something, I'll pop over into the software and we'll open up some of this stuff. But I took some screen captures here and just want to show you the parameter we're talking about. So when I go into an exercise, we're going to go into the weight parameter. Remember, when we look at these parameters, up to 3 that you can select. So in this particular instance, for the back squat, of course, my all-time favorite exercise for me that I love to do, I have 2 parameters selected, and we're going to focus on the weight parameter. When we open that up, we've got several different options we have when it comes to prescribing the load. We've got percentage of 1 rep max at the very top here. We've got a percentage of 1 rep max, a linked 1 rep max, which we'll show you here in a moment, percentage of body weight, absolute or raw load that we can prescribe in terms of pounds or kilos, a straight singular weight, or the new parameter, which we talked about in a previous webinar, is that weight range. And then the aforementioned parameter of percent difficulty, or that relative intensity. And we're going to really break that down and explain what that is too, because I think often when we start seeing percentages in particular, I know I do, I'm always saying percentage of what? That's a really important question to answer, is what is that related to when we talk about percentages, because you can get really lost in the minefield there of understanding what that is. So we're going to really break that down to make sure everyone really understands that going out of this webinar today. All right, let's show you the intensity of load first off, and how we would, possible ways of prescribing that for our clients and athletes. Number 1, so important thing to understand is that when we talk about intensity of load in terms of percentage of 1 rep max, there's relationships in terms of the amount of repetitions that can be performed. Obviously, 100% allows me to perform just 1 repetition. When I go down to 95%, I can typically perform, most people typically performed around 2 repetitions, 90% 3 to 4, 85% 5 to 6, and so on and so forth. So these are just some general relationships. The most important thing to understand is there's some limitations to this, and any kind of rep max charts based upon percentage of 1 rep max, because there's a lot of individual variability within this. I know there's a study out there that I've seen, and I didn't write the study down in this, but I know I've seen a study that references that there's the variability in terms of some test subjects that use 70% of their 1 rep max, and the range of repetitions that they were able to perform with that within the study was somewhere between like 8 and 20 reps or so. So that's a wide range. So it doesn't necessarily fit this 10 to 12 mark, but on average, that's where those numbers generally are. And the most important thing just is to understand is that as the percentage of 1 rep max goes down, the ability to perform a certain amount of repetitions to your limit goes up. Okay, the exact amount is highly variable, and there's some really cool stuff that the guys over at Data Driven Strength have done, was trying to kind of customize a personal 1 rep max or rep max chart for you based upon your own performance. If you have the ability to kind of have low rep capacity, average rep capacity like this, or you have the ability to do a lot of repetitions with a high percentage of your 1 rep max to really dial that scale in. But the key thing to understand, and I broke this chart down a little bit further here with 2.5% jumps just to get it a little more dialed in, so you can kind of look at it that way. There's a plus or minus a rep or two with each percentage, or if you're performing a number of reps, you know, plus or minus 1 or 2% in terms of 1 rep max. With that kind of can vary. The key thing to understand is that you can take this and put it into a rep max chart. We use this on a wall chart, but these numbers are useful in terms of they get you in the ballpark. My good friend Tristan Rice at Exos talked about this. Like, these are just kind of numbers. They get you into the ballpark, meaning a ballpark number, but they don't necessarily put you exactly at home plate. You may be way up in right field in the cheap seats up in there, but you're in the area, okay? You're not over in a different city when you do this. So these are helpful in terms of that. You just have to understand the limitations and not take these as set in stone relationships. So I apologize, this one's a little bit blurry, but this is a nice chart that we took all these different numbers, or they've been taken and put into a chart. So I can look at a raw poundage at a certain number of reps. So let's just use that 8 rep max example here. And we're going to go over here and find a way. We go over to, so the top column here is 8 as reps. I'm going to go over to that and go down the column here. And so let's say I was using 150 pounds for 8 reps. If I go down to this 150 over here, and it was a maximum effort for that, I can go over to the left, and that's going to show me that my estimated 1 rep max is 200 pounds, okay? If I wanted to see what I could potentially do at a repetition max for 15-ish reps, that poundage would go down to 120. So this is a useful chart in terms of kind of blending the digital and analog worlds. We took this chart and put it up on our wall in the gym, and we could reference this. Coaches and clients could look at this. That would help with load selections when we're prescribing, certain alternative ways of picking weights versus just putting a raw percentage of 1 rep max into that. We could look at these relationships and kind of figure stuff out really quick on the fly and make it very, very visible. So that's a nice blending of the two realms for that. Or you also take this, I've taken this and made a screen capture of it and put it into a person's program using that feature on the Bridge to be able to add media on that so they could look at it to help themselves pick load if I want to give them some more autonomy to choose those. But it's helpful to have it big and visible because it helps you kind of teach how to use it. So you can see, looking at the chart here, if I go back to that same example, that 150 here, if I move over to the left to figure out my 1 rep max, I can do that. I can also pick what the repetitions would be at a 4 rep max, 5 rep max, and so on, roughly. Again, these aren't exact, so there's some play in those numbers. But if I look over here on this chart, you can see that 78% is kind of like the RPE 10 range right here. This is the maximum. Then as I go down, those percentages are changing. As I move down here to that 150, I'm sorry, the number is the same. It doesn't change. I go down here to that 78%, and then I divide that in there, and that gives me that 200 number. So if I look over here, it's like 80%, 77.5. So that's that range that I talk about right here. So that's putting me in that ballpark number. So useful tool, and I highly recommend utilizing that. All right, so what does it look like when I put that into the Bridge? Very simply, if I'm prescribing 3 sets of 8 and I have a 1 repetition max on an exercise that is suited for a 1 repetition max. Either it's been tested or been estimated, potentially using a chart like that. I can plug it into the system, and then I can put it in here and add it by checking up here on this little button. Then I can put a percentage in there. So let's say I want to use 75%. I don't want it to be at the limit here. I want a couple repetitions in reserve, or a little bit of a 2-rep buffer here, because this 75% is usually going to be somewhere around a 10 RM, 11 RM load. I can prescribe that right in here. So that's how I would do that. And it's listed in there, okay? So very simple and straightforward on that. Limitation of it, obviously, is that you need to have a 1 repetition or estimate that. And I can plan this out going forward if I want to handle the progression plan, but that's a story for a different day. The other nice feature in here, and I talked about this in the webinar that we did a couple webinars ago about the updated parameters, is a new feature in the Bridge over the last few months is the ability to prescribe a weight range. So another limitation of prescribing a fixed 1% of 1 repetition max is that sometimes, because of that variability in the amount of reps performed, it might be a little too hard or too easy for a given client because the chart's not exact with that. So I can put a range there, which this is about a 5% range on that, or it is a 5% range on that for 5 reps on a back squat. What this shows on on the client side of things, in the mobile view on the app over here on the right, that's that percentage. It's showing that, and then it's giving me a weight range, so they can choose what that is. I can also intertwine a strategy with this, which I can write repetitions in reserve, how many repetitions I think they should have it this way, and put that either as a fixed singular RIR or give a range of repetitions. So I can really combine strategies here, but we can talk about that later. If someone wants to see that, you can just pop a question in if you want to see how I might prescribe that. So that's useful, and that kind of solves for one of those repetitions and making this a little more auto-regulatory, so to speak, so the client can choose within this range of weights that we can give based on the percentage, which is a sweet feature on that. Okay, so that's percentage of 1 repetition maximum utilizing the system. The next way of doing this, I mentioned in that definition of intensity of load, so I can just prescribe a straight 12 RM weight to them, but you'll notice I am communicating that to them using the notes feature here. I'm also telling them, this is also often forgotten because this is a question that comes up, should I use this for all 3 sets? If I've prescribed, as a simple example, of 3 sets of 8, yes, the answer is right there for you. Use the same load for all sets listed. So if I want them to prescribe to do 8 reps, I'm going to tell them to use their 12 RM load. So how do we figure that out? So let's use that example. This is 8 RM. I'm going to go down to that 150 example. I know what I can do for 8. I know that I can do, I want to use 12. I want to do 12 reps for that. So I'm going to choose, oh wait, I don't want it to be an 8 RM. I want it to be a 12 RM. Okay, so I'm going to go over here. I'm going to use 130, and I can plug 130 into this. Okay, so that's what I'm going to utilize for the, if I know what that is for the back squat, and just using that same number in this based on what that 1 rep max is or estimated to be. Then I would I could write in 120 myself on the athlete side or the client side of thing, or I could write it in as the coach if I want to pre-prescribe these loads on the back end to them. But it's a fixed weight like that based on either an estimate or based upon testing potentially. Do you understand too, though, when you start going way above, when you go above like 5 reps using those charts and the reps get higher and higher, the relationship to 1 RM gets less and less. So as that percentage of 1 rep max goes down, that load relationship really gets way more far off. So it's really most useful when you're looking at an relatively accurate 1 RM to use 5 reps and under when you're utilizing those charts and things like that. So do understand that, because that could be wildly variable. So another way of prescribing an intensity of load is using the linked ratio. And this is something some of you may want to see within when we go out of the PowerPoint at the end of the presentation, is how to utilize this specifically, because this is a really, really cool tool. You may have heard people talk about a training max versus a actual true max. So when you test a true max, let's just call it 400 pounds, okay, for a back squat to make it simple. My true max, I made a standard, good technique with it. It's 400 pounds, but it's an all-out effort. A lot of times we don't want to utilize the percentages of that all-out effort because I was psyched up. I peaked for that to be able to make that. Sometimes to make that 400 pounds, sometimes I want to use a little bit less than that, so it gives me a little bit of that rep buffer with it. So I can use a training max, which most coaches will prescribe. And you see this in Jim Wendler's famous 5-3-1 program. These are some percentages out of that. So we will utilize that on occasion with some of our client programming. We'll use 90 to 95% of that to kind of have that buffer so that the percentages aren't, as hard as overly hard and we get bad technique and things like that. So within the bridge, I can link the ratio here of these percentages to a training max, which I just said is 95% of the same exercise. It can also be a different exercise too. So I can base those percentages off of a different exercise and a percentage of that exercise. But in this case, I just wanted to use my back squat true max and use 95% of that for a training max, and then prescribe percentages off of the training max to link that. So that's the beauty of this that I can use. So I don't have to monkey with my actual true max. If I want to use a little bit less of it and prescribe percentages off of that, I can manipulate it by using the linked ratio. And again, I can show you how to do that after we get through the presentation here, because that's this awesome feature that I love to use. Sometimes I'll use like front squat percentages based off back squat, so I can do that too. Or for dumbbell bench press, you can base it off your bench press max. So super cool stuff that you can do if you're familiar with some of those ratios. If we want to go in detail of that, we can certainly do that a little bit later. So that covers most of your options when it comes to intensity of load prescriptions. Let's talk about intensity of effort. And their intensity of effort is not necessarily really that different when it comes to actual prescriptions. There's just different ways of communicating it. So I mentioned this earlier when we talked about RPE, rating of perceived exertion. So the problem with the term RPE is it can have many different connotations when you say RPE. So it can be applied to, traditionally it was done on the Borg scale, where it was applied to effort in terms of like cardiovascular exercise. Typically it was originally that 6 to 20 scale, which was based kind of dropping a 0 off based off resting heart rate, which was like 60-ish beats per minute, all the way to like a max heart rate, which is that 200 realm for most people. Then they just dropped the 0 off of that, and it was that 6 to 20 scale for it. Then it got kind of changed into a 10-point scale of 1 to 10. You applied it that way. RPE can be used to rate a session, as you see in the bridge. It can also be used to, like when I talk about doing like a compensatory acceleration, I'm doing an RPE 10 effort on 1 rep. I can push it at a 10 effort level to make it move as fast as I could. That would be an RPE 10. But it's all based upon, RPE is based upon what you're referencing, okay? So what it's anchored to. So when we say RPE, because it can be anchored to so many different things, it can get confusing. So in our chart that we use, and we base this off of one of the Zordo studies, we adapted it from that. We wrote right here, it's based upon repetitions in reserve. So as long as we have that understanding that when I say a certain RPE, it's based upon RIR, cool, no confusion, okay? But if we don't have that understanding, then people get very confused. So you have to be very clear with that. So what you'll see happening in the research nowadays is they'll use both terms when they're talking about this, often like they'll write RPE/RIR and communicate both things, or really these days, a lot of times it's just communicated in terms of raw RIR. Okay, so meaning how many repetitions you have in reserve of a certain when a certain number of reps is prescribed. So it goes all the way from 0 in this chart all the way to 6. It gets really hard to estimate when you've got more than 5 or 6 in reserve because it's really, really vague. That's where RPE is useful in communicating these things to these kind of squishy terms. All that said, RIR tends to be a better way to communicate this in general. So I just give you that to give you a little bit of background. And this is, originally Mike Tuchera from Reactive Training Systems really popularized this in the training world and adapting the scale. But I think that RIR is a little bit easier way to communicate it to athletes and clients. So the nice thing in the Bridge, you have that parameter available to you now. So I've reworked some of our stuff sometimes because I've used RPE in the past before RIR really got popularized and in terms of creating better clarity. So I will use both terms, but I make sure I communicate it both ways. So I'll write that RPE/RIR. All that said, I can communicate this to a client that if we're doing that same 3 sets of 8, I want them to use a load that leaves 3 repetitions in reserve. So use a load that leaves 3 repetitions in reserve, and that applies to the first set. Then again, I'm going to communicate what I want on the other sets. Use that same load on all the other sets that are prescribed. I'm going to ask them to record their RIR on all sets too. So there's a place for them to be able to write that in. So you should notice this looks very similar to that 12 RM idea, right? Although it would be 11 RM. This is almost be the same thing as saying utilize your 11 RM. That's really what you're doing here. What's good about the RIR number when we talk about progression plans, this allows you to auto-regulate on a daily basis and communicate what you're wanting how hard that set should be for the client, where they can kind of adjust it based upon that. But again, you're still going to use those numbers to kind of get a ballpark idea of what weight you should be using. So it's not just kind of pulled out of thin air. You have something to base it on. And that's where those charts are very useful. So it's really, like I said, a little bit more similar than it is different, just a different way of writing it or communicating it more than anything. Another way to utilize this uses that rep range feature for our clients and athletes. If I use 8 to 10, I'm going to ask them to perform those reps to an RIR stop of 2, meaning that when they get to 9 reps, if they're doing the first set, I want them to leave 2 reps in reserve, meaning they could do 11 reps, but they stop at 9. But I'm also going to communicate to them in terms of what I want. I want you to aim for the top end of the rep range, in this case 10, if able to do that at the prescribed RIR. So if you can do 10 reps and you could have done 12 reps, but you stop at 10, that's exactly what I want. When we're able to do all 10 reps, then we would go up and weight, and I would communicate that in a progression plan to them. But they're going to be in charge mainly of selecting the weight they can use based upon the effort level, right? On how hard that set is. So that's helpful in exercises like rows and things like that, where we don't necessarily have a 1 rep max relationship, or we're using reps that are so high that it's going to be kind of off, and communicating it this way sometimes works a little bit better. Okay, so the next one, this is probably one a lot of you want to know about, is percent difficulty. This is the other way of communicating the intensity of load prescriptions. This is a great one. It's something that works really, really well on the Bridge. It's a way to plan out loads over the course of a phase or a training cycle as well. So if you wanted to pre-populate in the, each session, you want to pre-populate some loads, this will do it based off of the repetition maximums and percentage of repetition maximums, which I'll talk about in a second. So percent difficulty, what is it? We're going to select that as our parameter. The key thing I want to note here, I selected 80% right here. That is not to be confused with 80% of 1 repetition maximum. the key relationship to understand is that this is 80% of the prescribed repetition maximum reps. Okay, so in this case, it's 8. This is going to be 80% of an 8 repetition maximum. Okay, that's the important thing to understand. So I wrote a little equation here. This was actually something, I like this way of writing it. This was in the Programming Demystified seminar that I watched with Strong First. I like this way of communicating it, and I applied it to this. This is percent in RN, and in being the rep number, in this case, 8. It could be 10, it could be 12, whatever is prescribed. So this number right here is this percentage of 8 rep max. So 80% of 8 rep max. So hopefully that is clear and that solves that for you so you know what you are using. There's a great chart that is in the Bridge. It shows you what those relationships are and how many repetitions you have in reserve based upon that. So again, you can see how these things are tied together. So this gives you some range with that. I created a chart too, which based off of this chart, which I'll show you here in a second, to kind of give me some idea too of what the repetitions are in reserve are. That so I can be a little more specific with it too when I'm programming this out as far as a progression plan, so you can utilize that. So let's take a look at this table. And I think I showed this in one of the previous webinars as well. This is something from Donnell Butcher and Adam Feit, who was Joe Kim's assistant strength coach. They came up with this chart for relative intensity. And basically what it is, you can see, is this percent difficulty over here, those percentages that we just prescribed, and the relative intensity, what it is. And if we look at the top here, these are repetitions, okay? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. These are all repetitions, so I want to make that clear because it's not labeled on here. And these numbers in the middle here, not these on the column, but in the middle, are the absolute intensity or percentage of 1 rep max, all right? So when you look at that 80% right over here in that example that we just gave you right here, let's take a look at this just so this makes sense. So I don't want anyone to walk out of this without the clarity of this. We're going to go over to 80%. That's the percent difficulty we assigned. And then we're going to move over to the right and find the 8 rep column. Again, it's not labeled there, so make sure you know what that is. That's repetitions. And then we find the 64% number. So that 64% is percentage of 1 rep max, okay, based upon that number. So that's what that is. So that is basically how percent difficulty is assigned. You'll notice that 64% is going to give me a lot of repetitions in reserve if I'm just performing 8 reps with it. So that's really the lowest, really, that I will use percent difficulty myself. I'm going to use that and upward to prescribe that over the course of a training cycle. 100% difficulty is going to be, 8 rep max. So that's going to be 80% of my 1 rep max. Generally, again, there's some playing that I want to make sure that's very clear to everyone that it may not be perfect as we want it to be. Well, we see these numbers, we want, no, that's number, that's what it is. Not so fast, my friend. There's some variability in that. Remember, there's some play, but it gets you in a close proximity to that. So this is how it would look like if I was going to kind of write out the percent difficulty over the course of this. This is using 5% jumps in terms of percent difficulty. And this would be obviously be a 5 rep max on this day. Then maybe the next week, once I'm able to do that, and it's not a 5 rep max anymore, I've got a buffer in that because I've been able to build up some capacity over the course of the training cycle. Maybe I take another week and I test it out and use those required sets to test that and say go for a new 5 rep max. All right, so the first thing or the last thing I want to point out is this is the main thing that we're trying to avoid when I talk about all this stuff. It's just putting this into a program, utilizing the same parameters. I give this to a client or an athlete with no communication. So I know what I want here. I want them to use a weight that they could use for 11 or 12 reps, but they don't know that. and I haven't written a weight down. It's blank. So they have to feel it out. If I am a programmer and I'm writing programs for my coaches to deliver, I haven't communicated that to the coaches. So that's on me. So I want to make sure I use clarity in writing notes and clarity in terms of prescribing loads for clients, and so that everyone knows exactly what they're supposed to do and there is no confusion about that. And I think that will lend to getting favorable results in all of their programs, because you're going to get the adaptations and the appropriate stressors that you're looking for when it comes to delivering your programming. So again, one of my favorite topics. We'll get into progression plans because I think that is an incredibly interesting thing as well if you're a programming geek like me. And I want to just ask you, what questions can I answer about what I just shared for you? Because I am happy to do that. I love answering questions, and I'm happy to bounce out and show you any specific things you would like to see on the platform itself as well.
It looks like we don't have any questions in here yet, but maybe as people are typing, if you want to go in and I know you mentioned the Percent One Army linked, maybe that as people get their questions in here.
Absolutely. All right, let me see here.
It looks like we lost your screen share as well.
Yeah, I'm going to put it back on here.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, we can see the PowerPoint again.
Okay. You got my...
Yeah, we can bridge.
All right, perfect. All right, so let's show you, let's use a different exercise. As much as I love the squat, I will leave the friend the squat here and give you a different exercise. So let's use a deadlift. All right. So I'm going to use a deadlift here. Now, let's say, for example, I want to use a training max for my deadlift. I don't want to use my true 1 rep max for this and prescribe percentages off of that. I'm going to use a training max, and I'm going to use 95% of my true max for this to prescribe a percentage. So how in the world do I do that? First off, I'm going to use a template set here. Let's use some of the 5-3-1 parameters. So let's use the 5-3-1s. Well, let's use a 5s wave, okay? From the Jim Wendler's 5-3-1 program. So I have some pre-saved template sets here. So I'm going to replace this. Now you'll notice I built this out on the back end for the coaches when they're prescribing this to say use linked percent 1RM to set training max as 90 to 95% of true 1 rep max with the same exercise of choice. So I'm going to check 1 rep max here first. I don't know if it's going to pop up here. Yeah. So we're going to use this. Let's call it of me 430. Okay. We'll use something that I did a while back. Now, so I know that's set. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use a link on that. So I'm going to go down here. This little link chain right here shows you how to do that. So I'm going to click that, and I'm using pounds as well. I'm going to click that. I'm going to choose that same exact exercise as a deadlift. Click on deadlift. And now the linked ratio is popping up there. It can be, if it's 100%, that's just going to be the exact same thing of that 430. It's going to show what that is. So I can adjust this and use a percentage of that 430 in this manner. Okay, so now that 95% number, to be clear what that is, so let's just take 430 times 95%. That's going to be like 408.5, let's call it 410. So these are going to be percentages right here of 410 because it's 95% of 430. So hopefully that is clear. That is how we can set that up, and that works wonderfully. Then it will show on the client. I can look at estimate weight. This is based off me. It's going to kick out the weights right here and show that's how it's going to show on the client side of things, either whether it's in the weight room mode or on the mobile view. But this is my true 1 rep max right there. So hopefully that is helpful and shows you how we do that.
Great, thank you. So we do have a couple that came in.
Awesome.
The first one, I normally use difficulty. New clients use light weights, and so this skews the next input. Any ideas?
Yeah, so with brand new clients, as the bridge is collecting data, it gets more and more accurate as they get more and more data as far as exercise history on clients. So it can be a little bit difficult with newer clients. And, you know, the variability in terms, they gain strength so fast. Sometimes it might be better just to prescribe like specific loads to them. So the way we do things, we get this question a lot. That's why this topic's so interesting, because some coaches will let their charges, whether mainly for athletes, kind of pick their own loads. And this is part of coaching too. You're having, while you're on the floor, you have to make these adjustments in real time to get what you are wanting as far as the relative difficulty of a set, not to be confused with percent difficulty, but how hard you actually want it to be, and making sure you have good technique and all that stuff. Those are the real-time adjustments you have to make, because as we all know, when left to their own devices, most people, depending on their personality, will either go way too hard or go way too easy. And we rarely get that, you know, just right porridge amount on the bar without kind of our intervention for that. So I think that just prescribing, like, for example, if I was going to do a deadlift, and I might just prescribe absolute weight, and as I'm feeling this out in terms of what they can do, that's going to be changing. So I'm going to be writing stuff in here all the time and gathering data for the system. So first phase or two, maybe I wouldn't personally use percent difficulty until I have some training data accumulated for it. And then you can start to build it out after that. So that would be kind of the way I would approach it, because we get that question like, how do you choose weights? Can I populate the weights? You can use the raw load, you can pre-write it all in, but again, you have to understand that when a client sees a weight in there, that's what they're going to do. Okay, they see that as being kind of written in stone, and that's the weights that they're going to use. So the way we use the system is we go back, our coaches actually, oftentimes, if we're not using like specific percentages of 1 rep max or percent difficulty, we're writing in like RIR. That's where RIR is useful, because I know how hard this set should necessarily be, or you can even use a range of RIR, which is useful as well. So this is another way to prescribe that. I can write 6 to 8. Whoops. Apply that to all. Come on. And now I know how hard that set should be, and I can manipulate that as the coach, because I know what I want out of that set. But again, it's communicated what that should be to me or to one of my coaches if I'm the programmer. So once you get that data, then you can move to percent difficulty. That's the way I would do it to get a little better accuracy. There's just going to be a little bit of that when someone's brand new of inaccuracy.
Okay, great. There's a few that have come up related to this, so I'm going to try and go to the ones that have now been specifically asked about this. So the next question, so if I want my clients to do 200 pounds of mass load and 100 of air load based, oh, this is 2 questions. Okay, let me start again. Sorry, everyone, that was confusing. Okay, I think this one will relate well since you showed us kind of using the range with reps and reserve. So this one's, I love the weight range tool. However, where it becomes too much is needing to input the weight one uses within that range for each set. Is there a way around this in which the weight range is just that, a range? I don't need the athlete to record the actual weight used. This is assuming it's an accessory exercise.
Not sure I completely understand. So what this does, when I prescribe a weight range, let's just say I want them to use between 300 to 315 on this. So what's going to happen in the system is this is going to show up for the client, okay? They're going to need to input something when I have a number written into the system as a range here. And they're going to have to input something. It's not going to let them basically, you know, the little ticks of the check marks. You're not going to be able to tick it off and move forward until you have inputted that data. You want that data because that's data you're going to use for percent difficulty and things like that. So it's going to, whatever weight they put on the bar, or on the, in this case, on the bar for the deadlift, they're going to need to write that in, the specific one that they used. So it's going to be like whatever, 305, they're going to need to write that in. Not sure if you can clarify your question a little bit as far as what you're looking for. Maybe I can answer that a little bit better.
Yeah, I think that was a good start. But yeah, technically, like how it works within Bridge is anytime a range is used, you will have to check it off. So there isn't really a way around it if you want to use this feature.
Yeah, so for example, on this one right here, where you just have an RIR written on the first set's going to ask me to put something in. If I don't have anything prescribed here below it, I won't have to do that. I don't have to put anything there. But yeah, I'll usually do that because I want a client to put something in there. So I'll say record RIR if I want RIR recorded where I left it blank.
So that could be a bit of a workaround too. If they don't want to have to manually enter and check it off, they could do it for the first set. So that could be a bit of an option there.
Yeah, if I leave these blank, I don't have to put it in the rest of the sets. I could just have it on one set.
Yeah.
If I wanted to. So
but it is a point that in order to kind of collect the data, it's important to have it input.
Man, that's again one of the reasons why we love the Bridge is because of that training data that you collect and be able to see it.
Yeah.
And utilize it.
Okay, we have a few more in here.
Awesome.
If a client comes in strong one day and makes a big jump, what's the best way to update the weight so this is reflected moving forward as the weights don't update in the software? Is it manually inputting the weights?
Yeah, put that in there, and like this is something that we talked about. I think when the way we used to do things on Excel back in the day, 3-4 years ago, whatever that was, is we had to have a column, right? We write a weight in for it when we use like a weight, like say day one, we started with 305 on the deadlift here. And then the next day, next session, I want the client to go to 315 or 310. I would write that weight into the next column, to that column for them, but not like date it. This is how we did it. So that way it tell them what I wanted the next weight progression to be. So we would do that. You can utilize eventually, once you have the data, percent difficulty for this. If you plan out, this kind of gets into progression plans, which will kind of, like I said, that'll be a good topic of another webinar, because that's what this really leads into. This is really talking about the first day of the load prescription for it, or maybe how to communicate it throughout the training plan, but it doesn't talk about the progression. So you can go into the system on the back end and write the load in for them. Percent difficulty is your best option for that. If you want to really plan that out, utilizing, you know, those little small percent jumps of percent difficulty going forward, but you're going to have to do that in the system itself. You can't go forward. You can use the comments to say what you want the weight to be, to update that too. Like we'll use that sometimes. Like I'll tell a client, go to 310 next workout, or tell them to make themselves a note for that so that they see that and they check their comments before they do the weight.
Great, that makes sense. Okay, we have 2 more in here. These will probably be kind of where we wrap it up based on time, but if anyone has anything super pressing, feel free to send it in quickly. Let's see. Will we see the ability to add additional loading parameters for accommodating resistance? Example, air, bands, and chains. So if I want my clients to do 200 pounds of mass load plus 100 air load based off of an estimated 1 RM.
As far as calculating the exact poundage for the bands and chains, that feature, I mean, you've got the ability to write the, again, you can select up to 3 on here. There's going to be some constraints in that. You can select like the size of the band, but not necessarily the weight of the band on it yet. So you don't have that feature yet. I don't know if that's something in the works. Maybe Lauren can speak to that. But right now you can kind of track what band you may be using if you don't have, like, say, I don't select RIR and I select band resistance over here, and I'm going to use like the heavy band on this, I can select that. So yeah, not the poundage on there though, because that's, again, kind of variable depending on the different bands that you're using. So
yeah, that's the only kind of option we have right now for bands. And then air resistance is also a parameter that can be used.
Yeah, like with Kaiser and stuff.
Yeah, if that is of interest. So that one is available. Okay, great. So one more question in here. This might be off topic, but can you read the analytics from these results for a 6 to 8 week cycle? How can you read the analytics from these results for a 6 to 8 week cycle? I guess the best way to kind of view the data.
Is there like a report for it? Is that what he's asking? To read like for an exercise, individual exercise?
Maybe. Yeah, I mean, that would probably be best. Or yeah, athlete history here might be a good place to show.
I mean, that's what I would do, is go into, and this is going to show you a bunch of different things, but with the weights used recently, and this is going to include warm-up sets and things like that as well. And they may not be high RPE sets. They can be lots of different things within that. So, or low RIR sets, since trying to use that terminology more these days. And I do a lot of deadlift singles for different things. So that's how you can look at the data on it. As far as building out a report, I personally don't use that feature a whole lot. I know that's probably a feature that's used a whole lot in team sport settings. So Rob might be a good guy, Hartman, to talk about that one in a future webinar or discussion too.
Yeah. Yeah, we do have some different reports available in the analytics on your homepage. So that is a great place to kind of look to see. Okay, so there is a clarification. So it looks like they want to be able to look at the coach, so the coach can see their progression. Like, how would you best do that? Would that be
on an exercise?
Yeah, or like based on kind of what you've been building. So would you mainly just look at the athlete history as you're building more progressions in the builder?
Yeah, I would look at that. I look at the previous programs across that from, you know, the calendar page. I'll look at a course of a training program and just click across it and get a scan of those things. If it's a specific exercise that you're looking for, you can go into, man, I haven't done that in a long time. Let me see here. Test results.
Oh, are you looking for a specific? Oh, for they're asking for a program, not for exercise.
The program. Yeah, I haven't done that a whole lot, so not sure on that one. So I apologize. I'm just not a little bit outside the scope of how I utilize the bridge.
Yeah, I'd say the best way is kind of looking through the program. You can go into load progression view. That will help you kind of see how you may have progressed different movements so you can see kind of groups of movements throughout the program, because that's a view that you can kind of see each day throughout the week or each
Yeah, I'll
week.
show you that real quick.
Yeah. So that's helpful. And then being able to pull up the athlete history while you're in the builder so you can kind of switch between.
Well, let me show you it this way. So a load progression view. Let me see here. Basically, what you're going to do, and I don't have something dropped in here. I'm going to do that real fast for you, just to show it. Just pull a template up. So if I want to look at something across like one day, that's why it's important to write these things in columns. I want to look at all my day A or day one workouts. I'm just going to go here to week view. And if I want to build out a progression, I know it sounds like from the nature of the question, they're looking at wanting to see the weights of this across the cycle. This will let you see the rep program. If I want to change the rep programming, I can do that because this is only showing me that day A or day one program across versus this is not a week view. This is a training cycle view to go in and take a look at that. So if I was going to go look at individually a program, I would need to like go onto a client page and then look at each day across that to see what's going on as far as the weights that they use, because that'll show you the recorded data from a client. Okay, so hopefully that kind of helps.
Great. Yeah, I think those are kind of the best options that we have for that. Okay, well, that was all of our questions and we are at time. So thank you so much, Craig, for walking us through all of this. And thank you all for joining. As I mentioned, we recorded this session, so we'll be following up with an email with the recording. I'll also include the blog that Craig mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, so you all can check that out. And I'll link to some of the previous webinars Craig's done with us too.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate your time. And I hope you got something useful that you can put into practice there, and it helps clarify how to do some of those things.
Great. Thank you all. Have a good day.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye.